This is House Planning Help, episode 396. Hello, I'm Ben Adam Smith, and this is the podcast for you if you're interested in self-build or retrofit. I'm exploring what houses we should be building in the 21st century and try to break down the major roadblocks that may get in our way. Coming up in this session, my guest is Mark Doodes from Mark Doodes Planning. We're talking about replacement dwellings, getting planning permission for them. There are all sorts of ways that I find guests for this podcast, and this one was prompted by a question from Aaron. He's in the middle of a project and was just finding getting planning permission for a replacement dwelling was anything but straightforward. So we often, when we come up with an idea, we put it on the ideas list. It can sometimes stay there a while. We want to get the right guess. And a little while back, it was the launch of the Retrofit Zone, a new section of the National Self-Build and Renovation Centre. So I was there for that and got chatting to Mark and identified him. He knows his stuff. He's going to be the man. Let's sign him up for this podcast and find out more. And incidentally, that should definitely be on your research route. Here in the UK, we're very lucky to have the National Self-Build and Renovation Centre. So pop down there as part of your research. Let's get to our featured interview with Mark Doodes. He's a member of the Royal Town Planning Institute. He's an independent planning consultant and he runs Mark Doodes Planning. We're talking about replacement dwellings, and I started by asking Mark to tell me a little bit about his background.
I originally qualified in computer science and information systems, and having finished the degree, I was a little, shall we say, underwhelmed with working in IT, and really enjoyed hearing from my friend Jonathan whenever he was talking about his job, about shaping the built environment and influencing applications and structures and estates and etc. And I always found that really interesting. And then we were having dinner one evening and he mentioned that there was a huge demand for people with IT skills in the planning industry. This is, of course, in the Tony Blair years. And there was a huge push towards e-planning, in putting plans online, allowing people to view and comment on plan applications online. And so I contacted my local authority and ended up getting a job in the planning department there, working with a mixture of planning applications and on e-planning projects, which was really interesting. And then over time, I realised I found the planning more interesting, and then worked in planning authorities for a number of years on e-planning and planning projects. And then when it was originally a recession and then became the big credit crunch, me and a lot of other people in local authority planning departments lost their jobs, which originally at the time I thought was the worst thing to happen to me, but actually turned out to be the best thing to ever happen to me. And I have worked in private practice and local authorities, and then more recently, certainly 11, 12 years ago now, set up my own practice. And that was probably the best decision I ever took.
So it's quite interesting to have this contrast, because we see it from time to time that people start with the local authority and then have that knowledge, comprehensive of how it works. So how does it feel different? So I agree entirely with what you're saying. I think that the best planning consultants, certainly the best ones I've come across, all have a blend of public sector and private sector experience, because when working in the public sector, you get to see, frankly, hundreds and hundreds of cases. You'll have a concurrent caseload that could be around 30, 40, 50 cases. And you will see so many different application types and so many mistakes, frankly, that are made. There's so many own goals that are scored. And actually you get better and better and you learn from other people's mistakes. So you always say that there are expensive mistakes to make in life and inexpensive mistakes to make in life. And when you're working for a local authority, of course, when you see errors, they don't cost you anything. They've just cost somebody else's client a lot of money. And so over time, I realised actually I'm actually able to offer advice that's much more valuable to an agent or an applicant. And so I realised actually I probably don't belong in this sector. And around that time, I was offered a job with a much larger practice than I presently have, but offered a job with that practice, and that really was something that appealed to me, and it was something that I learned a huge amount from that practice as well. What are we talking about when we say the planning system?
So the planning system is a collection of legislation, secondary legislation, so regulations. It's also a mixture of local plans, neighbourhood plans, which are at the very hyper-local level. They're also a mixture of case law and appeal. So when people say the planning system, it's how those moving parts all operate together to guide a decision maker towards a decision, whether that's approve or refuse. And so the planning system is actually quite difficult to define and very difficult for neophytes, to people new to the system, to navigate, because they see one element of the things I've just mentioned and think that that is therefore the end point of the decision. You know, I'm in the green belt, this is a greenfield site, I therefore can't do anything, which may well be the case, but it's certainly worth exploring the other avenues. Or equally, they'll see something in an urban area and think, well, absolutely, I don't see any reason why I couldn't do this. And of course, there could be other emerging regulations or an emerging local plan which could preclude your proposals from being acceptable. So it is important to take decisions from to look at all of those different sources, and frankly, to take professional advice if you are looking at buying a site. It's slightly different if you already own a site, but equally, before you're about to start off on a planning endeavour, it is important to have some cold planning advice that can just tell you what your chances of success are, what the constraints are, what that consultant's experience brings to the table.
Are there any rules of thumb for planning? You talked about the local plan and these sorts of things. Are there areas that are marked for development, and how often do they change?
Yeah, there are. I mean, of course, with a local plan, you know, and a neighbourhood plan to a lesser degree, with a local plan, you will see allocations. Now, allocations are where the local authority has taken its time, usually a few years, to weigh up all the different options, whether that's greenfield sites or brownfield sites, weigh those up and allocate those for a particular land use, be that housing or industry or commerce, you know, employment generating sites or whatever they are. So that's the allocation process. And the same is true at the local level in neighbourhood plans. You might find a neighbourhood plan has allocated space for what it considers a reasonable amount of housing growth in its village. So that could be, you know, one house, could be 5 houses, could be 50 houses. So they would allocate those houses through that process. So yes, the plan-led system, which is in paragraph 2 of the NPPF, is important, but it isn't the end point, is sort of the point I'm making here. So it is important to consult your local plan rather than just using Google Earth. You know, the number of people that present to me a satellite image of a site and say, hey, what do you think of this? Well, I'm not really interested in what I think of it. It's a greenfield site. I don't know anything about the policies that apply to it. And understanding that that most sites in most parts of the country, frankly, are developable. You know, you could build a house on that site. The question is whether or not it's acceptable in the spatial plan. And that differentiation is important. A number of people I hear coming to me saying, well, we've got power on the site and we've got water, so what's the problem? Well, the problem is you're 2 miles away from the nearest village. And generally speaking, our planning system precludes isolated houses and isolated locations unless it's for a specific purpose, like agriculture or forestry, for example. So it's important to change your mindset about that, and utilities are nothing to do with it. The plan system is very important, so it's important to start your research at the local plan and then build on from there. And of course, your local plan, like around half the local plans in the country, are actually out of date. So that also becomes a problem for people, because if they're looking at a local plan that expired 3, 5, 10 years ago, you'll be thinking naturally, well, where's the starting point? And actually the starting point is then this sea of ever-changing regulations and case law and appeal decisions that come out. And that's where a professional can really add value in being able to assist, because frankly, most of the people listening to this podcast are not going to own an allocated site. They're going to own a small site, possibly a paddock on the edge of a village, or a house with a very large garden, or a house they want to replace. That type of small sites don't generally get allocated unless it's at the hyper-local level, the neighbourhood plan level. So again, you're still back to square one in terms of where do we start.
Is there a hierarchy that the major developers are seen as more important? They will tick off 500 houses here, whereas us with our individual projects, this is going to be more of a challenge, or is everyone treated like for like?
Well, the answer, like all things in planning, is yes and no. A scheme of 500 houses, whether it's allocated or not, if there is a shortage, a demonstrable shortage, a recognised shortage of housing in the district, i.e. a 5-year housing land supply shortfall, that 500 house scheme would and should be given considerable weight, not only for assisting the council in meeting its housing targets or quotas, but also in meeting its social obligations, i.e. through the provision of social housing. So social housing is affordable housing. And when I say affordable housing, I mean with a capital A and a capital H, not affordable housing as in it costs less for people to buy. You can't buy, as a member of the public, you can't buy an affordable house, social house. It's only the council that operate those through their register of social landlords. So those are then let out on a social basis. So previously you might have known them as council houses, but they're socially rented houses. So the only way that those houses can come forward is through the sequestering of land and through the Section 106 process attendant to a planning application. So when Barratt Homes or Persimmon Homes come along with a 500 unit scheme, they rightly should have significant weight ascribed to their ability to assist the council in hitting its targets. It doesn't mean they'll be popular, doesn't mean that those houses, everybody would want to live in that type of house. But it's only right, isn't it, that a scheme that delivers 500 houses would be given considerably more weight than a scheme that delivers just one. And of course, all those benefits for the single house are private benefits. They're benefits to the applicant. They're not social benefits. You're not building one affordable house and one open market house.
We're going to talk about replacement dwellings. So where do we start with this? What are the considerations?
So, of course, you do have a presumption in favour of replacing a dwelling. So let's just get that on the table straight away. The nature of the replacement dwelling does vary considerably according to its constraints. So let's imagine a few scenarios. Let's imagine that there's a bungalow in the Greenbelt, and the regulations that govern the replacement of dwellings in the Greenbelt would be in the local plan, of course. But if that local plan is significantly out of date, and I can think of, for example, Chiltern District Council's local plan is out of date, it's in Buckinghamshire now, but the spatial area of Buckinghamshire, that's Chiltern, and their policy would have had a percentage uplift. So I think from memory it's 30% or so. But that would be an out-of-date policy, and so you would be able to argue that the National Planning Policy Framework takes primacy there. And paragraph, I think, 144 of the framework talks about replacement dwellings not in the Greenbelt not being significantly larger. I think the word is disproportionately larger that's in the framework. And so it's important to think about that word, of course, but there are strategies around that. So, for example, we often deal with sites in the Greenbelt where you would have a replacement dwelling. And what you would do is try and exercise all of the permitted development rights first. So, for example, Class AA rights to raise the ridge, to add an extra floor or two onto the building. Even if the client doesn't want to build that, you are adding volume, and that's buying you a trading. So it's allowing you something to trade and haggle with the local authority. And then you would exercise all your other permitted development rights, your side extensions, dormer windows, etc., until you get to a volume. And then you can add whatever that number is in the local plan, whether it's 20, 30, 40% on top of that. And that gives you a volume to which to play with. That's the starting point, really. Ideally, you'd want something a bit smaller than that in volume, but it shows you how a relatively simple application in the Greenbelt of replacing a dwelling, you actually can end up with a strategy involving 2 or sometimes 3 applications to get to what you want to get to. And it's a little bit like I was always given the analogy of when you are cooking, you place a frog in boiling water, it will jump straight out, but you put the frog into cold water and then slowly heat that up, the frog will stay in there until it dies. And actually that's a little bit like planning. It's you're slowly through iterative cycles of applications, you're getting to where you want to get to. I just need to make clear to the audience that I have never boiled a frog, but but the analogy is there. But the analogy is there, and so that's something to think about. So let's think about another scenario with replacement dwelling. Let's think about an example where you have a cul-de-sac of bungalows. They might be interwar houses, for example, and you want to take down one of those. And I always think about the monopoly houses. So imagine you've got a greenhouse, 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 and you want to replace the greenhouse with a red hotel. And that, of course, is just going to look out of kilter it's going to look out of character for the area. So you need to think very carefully about that. And of course, you can try and create a fallback position through the Class AA route, which we just talked about, but that's only applicable to houses built after 1947. And so you need to think about how you can develop that house while still maintaining some of the character. And there are other scenarios in the opposite direction where every house down the road has been developed and you're left with the greenhouse on that monopoly board. And I can think of a client we're working on right now in Camberley where he is the odd one out. Everybody else, through the passage of a number of decades, has developed into some frankly pretty big houses. We're talking 4,000 to 5,000 square feet. And he is the one left with the interwar bungalow. So actually he is the other way around. You want him to make the biggest application possible, otherwise that would be out of keeping with the area. And other examples would be where in replacement dwellings, again in urban areas, you need to think about the size of your plot and also if it's economically worthwhile. Your objectives should always have in mind that is this worthwhile financially? And if you don't think about it financially, either the next buyer will or your mortgage company will. Because if you're about to say, imagine buying a car and you want to put a spoiler on the back and the best hi-fi in the world and stripes down the side, those look wonderful to you, but you try and sell that to somebody else and they may not actually like the things and all the money you've spent, and you certainly won't get back the money you've spent on it. So it's important always to think, nobody would lend on that car, for example. Nobody would be prepared to give you a loan. So you need to think hard about whether it's worthwhile. Look at the value of the asset you're about to demolish. Look at what you're left up with. If the finances aren't important to you, you're paying with cash, for example, or it's going to be your forever home, that's fine, but just go into it with open eyes.
Now, you've mentioned some scenarios which I'm sure will crop up again during this conversation, so don't worry about that too much. But if we start with a dwelling, are there ever any circumstances where that is considered first of all? Is this something that should stay here?
That's a really good question, actually. So let's cover that off. So listed buildings, you can just forget demolishing those. There are very limited circumstances when the demolition of a listed building would be suitable or appropriate. A good example is the erection of the new runway at Heathrow. There's a few listed buildings. I think there's a church that has to be demolished in order to make way for that runway. We've also seen the really controversial example on Oxford Street of the listed building. I think it was a Marks & Spencer store, and they have retained the facade and everything behind that has been demolished. So that's a good example there. But generally speaking, in the villages and provinces, you are unlikely to get permission to demolish a listed building, very unlikely to do that. There have been projects that we've worked on where a listed building has burnt down through no fault of the client, and the client has bought it at auction off the insurance company after loss adjusters. And that is different again. But of course, actually, even in that instance, the rebuilding of that house was highly controlled by the local authority, and rightly so. They wanted to retain the character, which was the chimneys, the retaining original facade. But we did manage in that case to build a huge basement, as long as it had the same style thatch roof and retained all the original character. And actually driving down that road, which I was able to do the other day, some year after it was completed, did feel really good because the building looked so similar to what was before, but actually behind that veneer was actually a very modern, beautiful architect design home, and that was a really lovely project to be involved in. That was in Oxfordshire. But to answer your question, if I may just go back to the previous question about local plan policies. Local plan policies can change. So I remember being involved with a project in West Berkshire, and when I was first involved in the project, their replacement dwelling policy didn't talk about was reasonably happy to move the building itself within the curtilage or the land around the dwelling. But the new local plan policy, which came out last year, that policy had slightly different wording, which wasn't as positive. So you have to be very careful and mindful that policies can and do change over time. So bear in mind how long projects take. So it's very easy for a project to take a year or 18 months to get from the point of first buying a site on auction or a house on auction or through the normal process. That process could easily take 6 months. And then you're assembling your team and making the planning application. During that time, for all you know, the local authority could be beavering away with a new local plan with a policy which isn't as favourable to your objectives. So you need to be mindful of that.
Is there any reason why they don't specify this house can grow 20% or you can move this house 2 metres off its original footprint? Why is it in wording that then becomes tricky it's the best court case almost?
Yeah, that is a good question, actually. You rarely see specific prescriptive numbers. And I think it's because, having worked in local authorities, if you tell someone something has to be 20% bigger, you will inevitably get someone who wants 22% bigger, and then you're told you're unreasonable for arguing over the 2% and what possible difference could it make. And so I think the planning system is quite mature in that it intentionally omits specific prescriptive volumes or numbers or areas, whatever they are, wherever possible, and allows the judgment of the decision maker to take decisions in the round. I mean, for example, that replacement dwelling I was just talking about, the development I'm thinking of doesn't comply with every aspect of the replacement dwelling policy. However, it does bring with it a significant highway safety benefit by relocating a dangerous access. And so under your scenario, where if it was 22% bigger or not 20% bigger, it would automatically be refused, even though there was a significant benefit. And that's the good thing about the planning system, in that it entrusts decision makers to make decisions in the round, which is balancing up the pros and the cons of a development and the policy conflicts against the policy harmonies.
I'm thinking of one scenario where a couple have built a new home, might be on an old pigsty or something like that, and the form of it is very strange. It's long and thin to match what was there before, whereas common sense would say to me, why can you not turn it into a better shape? It's probably in the middle on a farm, no doubt.
So if you have a beautiful old, typically a stone barn, let's say, that is really characterful, then you and the local authority would probably not want to destroy it and replace it with a modern faux barn or other building. So I can understand it from that perspective. But equally, if the piggery in this instance isn't particularly beautiful and it's not next to a listed building or in a conservation area, then actually that couple could have gone back into planning and replaced it and swapped it out, used it as a fallback position for something that would be much more close to what they actually wanted in the first place. There are quite a few reasons why people don't do that second planning application, and I'll just go through a few of those. Firstly, they might have got either financially or emotionally exhausted by the planning system by that point in time. One thing I always say to people when they're buying sites is have a look. They might bring a site to me and say, well, I want to do X or Y with this site. What do you think, Mark? And the first thing I do is I look at the planning history. If there has been a 4 or 5 year drawn out battle with appeals, resubmissions for a development, that tells you, first of all, you're unlikely to be able to change the scheme because there's been so much negotiation and discussion with the local authority already. But also, secondly, it might indicate why the couple want to move on. They may not actually be able to achieve what they want to achieve. The couple may be expecting another child, and the scheme they've developed is only 3 bedrooms. They need a 4th, so they might be selling it. So I'm going to give a typically planning answer here of it depends, and it is very much dependent on the site. But you're absolutely right. If you do have permission for something, in theory, you can nearly always trade that out for something. But you do need to be mindful of what the local authority would like to see. So that piggery might actually be useful in the sense that it preserves an important vista from a public right-of-way across to a listed building, a beautiful old church, for example. And if you replace that piggery with a 2-storey building of modern design, that might be beautiful in your eyes, but it might completely obfuscate the view of that heritage asset, which would be something which would be detrimental in the round. And so planners have to make those decisions.
And is it the end of the line? Let's say you get rejected. What are some of those common reasons, and can you just go back again afterwards?
Yeah, so when I first started in planning, I had a concurrent caseload of about 20 to 25 planning applications, which at the time we all thought was an awful lot of cases in the planning department. But over the years, that number grew and grew. And so I think when I left, I had about 35, 40 cases. And I spoke to a planner in Buckinghamshire the other day who had a caseload of about 55 or 60 cases.
Sorry, what does that actually mean? When have they got to get it done?
On their table at that moment. So the planning system is actually more like a sausage factory. You have planning applications coming in at the beginning. They go through the sausage factory and get processed. And then at the end, it spits out decisions. So I'm talking about the bit in between the submission and the making a decision. And a planning officer could have dozens and dozens of planning applications in front of them. So the idea, you often hear people in the pub, if they don't know what you do for a profession and they're talking about planning, you always hear people say, oh, well, if I apply for something far larger than I want and I'll get negotiated down for something smaller. But those negotiations don't always take place. I would say in 70% of cases, you will just end up with a refusal or be asked to withdraw the case. You're better off making the best planning application you can, which is the best compromise internally, i.e. between you and the client, for what you think you can achieve. And then once you get permission, if the client wishes to, they can follow up that application with another one. So a subsequent application to maybe, add a basement or add an extension at the back or raise the ridge to facilitate a eaves development on the first floor, that type of thing. So I think you are better off making the best application you can and fighting for it rather than putting in something that you think you're trying your luck with in the hope that the negotiations take place. And of course, like all negotiations in life, you're assuming both parties want something. With a local authority planning officer, they don't necessarily want anything particularly. They just want the case off of their desk. And so it's like if we're negotiating over selling a car, you're assuming I want to buy the car and I'm assuming you want to sell the car. That isn't always the case with local authority discussions because they're relatively ambivalent in one sense about whether the application goes one way or the other. They just want to reach a point where they have made the right decision in their eyes.
Is it a good thing to make their lives easier?
You often hear people say things like, oh, if you make a nuisance of yourself with the planner, then you're more likely to get an approval. But actually, we are not, certainly in my practice, I don't chase particularly planning officers. Give them the space to make the right decision, give them all the reports they need to write the right decision, keep monitoring the planning application. We do so twice a week in my practice. But first of all, you're right, just making the best application you can to start with is probably the best thing you can do. So if your planning consultant is telling you there may be a problem with bats in that building you want to demolish, for example, just get the survey done. Get the preliminary roost assessment done, get an ecology survey. If you think there may be a problem with drainage because the client knows that there's problems with drainage in the area, get a drainage report done. So you can amplify your application, or you can really make it, give it the highest chance of success by just reading the site, listening to your advisors, and putting the best application in. And a great example is things like tree surveys. If you've got an access that should be relocated or widened, let's say, but it cuts across a root protection area, you need to take advice about what to do about that. If it's your tree, there's decisions to make about that, and it's unprotected, there's decisions to make about that. But equally, you can talk to your tree advisor and they might have some ideas about the type of surfacing to use on that new entrance, whether it's shallow root or pile drive supports or whatever it is, that would actually mean that you don't have to remove the tree, or there's other ways around it, or it allows you to make decisions. So I suppose the upshot of that question is to make sure that you're putting the most robust application in from the outset. That's probably the one thing you can do.
You mentioned coming to you in those early days and how you might be able to just give us some guidance on whether it's a good site. So what might that look like?
Yeah, so that's, I think we offer two levels of service for those people in that position looking to buy sites or perhaps inherit or perhaps develop a site they already have. The first one is a Zoom call. So we offer a Zoom call for £200. And that will allow you to have around half an hour to 40 minutes discussion. We will do a little bit of research on the site in terms of the key headline constraints. Is it in the green belt? Is it in the OMB, etc.? And then it really gets the idea for you to just have a Q&A session with us, to you to be able to pick my brains for that period of time. And that's a really popular service. We probably do 3 or 4 a week of those. And then the next level up, if you want something a bit more informed, or you've already done the basic constraint check, or you've been referred to me through another means, is a site assessment, sometimes called a planning viability study. You might have heard of these from online. And those are a really useful documents. They are typically 20 to 25 pages long. They contain all of the headline constraints, the policy constraints, the physical constraints, what's happening with the local plan, the status of it, the 5-year land supply position, if the neighbourhood plan's doing anything, what emerging areas. So it's really that kind of cross-cutting summary, snapshot of what is happening with your site, and is now a good time to apply or hold on to it? Do you need to rush the application through because something is happening that would threaten the planning viability of the site? It's a really good report, and yeah, it is a bit of a plug, I suppose. That is about £1,000. But like I say, most people are delighted with those, and the people that are most delighted, that give us the best feedback, are those who are dodging a bullet, who are about to buy a site, thought it looked great.
Right, yeah,
looked great on Google Earth, didn't it? And
yeah.
you've got the utilities there, you've got the electricity there, you've got the power, you've got the water. Why not? Bloke down the pub said it was fine. But the moment the professional looks at it, you realise, hang on a minute, there's some real problems here, which are going to cause you significant issues, and you really need to reconsider. And we give you a clear conclusion, because that's the important point. It's not just here's a bunch of constraints. It's here's the analysis, and here is a clear conclusion with an idea about what the cost would be of a planning application, how long it will take, and the probability of success. So I think we call it kind of opinion heavy and constraint light, whereas I've read lots of outputs from lots of other planning practices. And I often find it the other way round, where it's a lot of constraints telling you, oh, you're in the conservation area, or you're in the green belt, and here's what it means. You know, most people can find that out for themselves relatively easily. What you want to know is, where is the critical path for this project? What the key issues are going to be, and does it have a planning future? Is it worth investing in, basically? And
it's about risk, isn't it?
It is.
You're trying to limit.
I always say to people, everyone understands planning is a gamble. People just want to know if they are flipping a coin, rolling a dice, or rolling some 20-sided dice, or just playing the lottery. People need to just know what the probability of success is. And I think that's one thing that professional advice from a chartered town planner can really add is your ability to determine what the probability of success is, because people want to make informed decisions, and there are just too many vested interests in the industry. It could be the estate agent selling you the land, it could be the landowner telling you about it, it could be some beautiful architect designed illustrative layout that's come up on that. We've all seen them, haven't we? Illustrative elevations of a beautiful building, but of course, without a planning permission, that's just a dream.
So in that respect, is this a safer route to planning permission?
Yes, absolutely. Buying a house with a view to demolishing it and rebuilding it definitely has a higher chance of success than buying a greenfield site.
Because the worst case scenario is you've got your house.
Yes, that's right. Absolutely. The worst case scenario is you've got a house. People might be letting it out while the process is going on. And generally speaking, the house prices in this country have been pretty steady. Certainly in America, you often hear about house prices yo-yoing 10, 20% in any given year or decade, and that doesn't generally happen over here unless there's some catastrophic event, in which case people would probably just hunker down and hold on to their asset if they can. But yes, you're right, you do have the surety of the UK housing market, which generally seems to be pretty stable. I'm not saying it's going up 5% a year, but it's certainly not going down 5% a year.
And what does it look like in terms of the paperwork, the back and forth, versus when you actually start things and demolish?
So you should allow plenty of time for planning. I think when we've all watched Grand Designs, nobody gets to the end of the process and says, gosh, that UK planning system was so predictable, inexpensive and consistent. No one says that. So allow plenty of time, plan for the worst case scenario. And that came back to that point about constraints. If you think there might be a drainage problem, if you think there might be a tree problem or an access problem, or there's a problem with the visibility due to the speed limit outside the road, get that work done and plan or set aside money to get that work done. We, generally speaking, as a planning practice, submit most of our work in outline. It doesn't mean you can't submit your full PP application with all your architect's elevations, etc. But we find outline a very powerful vehicle. It's essentially all the same ingredients. You still have to have all your reports, etc. But you are removing the fixed elevations and floor plans. And if you do just want to address the principle of development, outline is a very good format. But if you do have plans and elevations in mind that you really have fallen in love with, then definitely go down the full PP route.
So the outline permission, is that binding though?
Yes, it is a formal decision. It is a planning application. It will be on the public record forever. And it is an asset that you can sell. So if you get a permission to demolish a house or build, erect any dwelling or dwellings, you can sell that consent. It doesn't have to be yourself implement it unless there's some legal agreement indicating otherwise. Then you can sell it on. So yes, it is a permission. It is very important. There is also another type of permission called the permission in principle, PIP, which is relatively recent. It's only been around, I think, about half a dozen years or so. And those are meant to be, really, they're sort of filling the void left by outline becoming more and more heavy and document heavy. They're really there to fill the void left between a kind of pre-app and an outline permission. So that gap in the market was filled by the PIP, which was meant to be a stripped down version of a planning permission. There's no doubt that can be a successful route to a low cost planning application, but we have seen problems with PIPs. We have seen problems where people have been buying a PIP and then the technical details consent, the TDC, the second part of the PIP, those technical details may actually never be forthcoming. You may have a problem with drainage or a problem with some element of the site that you simply can't resolve, and therefore your PIP is worthless. So you might have bought something that you can't implement. Something may have changed in the intervening years since the PIP was issued and granted. So the outline permission or the full PP that you're being asked to apply for may not actually get approved. And equally, we've seen problems where we've obtained PIPs for people and they're looking to sell those. And then understandably, people are asking all the right questions at the conveyancing stage, and you simply can't answer those. Notably around drainage, actually, is a really good example. How is foul drainage being handled? Surface water issues, there might be problems with ecology or some newts or bats on the site. How are those going to be addressed? Or some other issue that isn't covered under the PIP. So as a practice, we don't generally apply for PIPs. We have done a few, but we don't generally apply for PIPs. We much favour outline because it gives you much more surety as a client and much more surety as a buyer that a lot of the due diligence has been done by other parties. So, it'd be done by the local authority, whereas local authorities simply won't be checking some of those areas. They're not allowed to because they're precluded from the PIP consideration.
So we've talked about things like the size, maybe increasing that. We've talked about moving it. But what about things like what is being replaced? Are there incentives for energy efficient homes, or is that what the local authority are looking to, or is that by the by, it doesn't matter, it was a dwelling, doesn't matter what the next one is?
Yeah, I agree. And it's something that comes up quite often. So what I always say to people is, first of all, what does the local plan say? So that very much varies. So, for example, South Oxfordshire District Council have a policy, I think it's policy DM10, which talks about energy efficiency, and you have to submit an energy report with standard air pressure testing, and they expect a certain standard. And then there are other local authorities, a good example is West Berkshire, who expect buildings to be of a certain amount of energy efficiency as well, measured in different ways. So my point is, and then some authorities don't mention it at all. So do those things because you want to do it and it's the right thing to do, but don't think it's going to necessarily add any value in the planning process, because if you comply with the policy in the local plan, now whether it's SODC or wherever it is, if you comply with that policy, that only gives you neutral weight. You are complying with the policy. You don't get brownie points just for complying with what the local plan says.
And when we talk about replacing this dwelling, when does it have to be done? Or is that something that can vary? You could live in the house till the new one's built. Well, no, I suppose that's not going to make sense if you're replacing it on the spot, but sometimes there might be, that opportunity.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So the planning system is quite relaxed about that, actually. So you can get permission, let's say you got permission for a house next week to replace it. You have 3 years, if it's a full PP, you have 3 years to start the works, but there is no back date on when those works must be finished. There hasn't been a piece of case law yet, that's certainly one that I'm aware of, where the local authority have said to a developer after 5 or 10 or 15 years, you must finish this house. And therefore that has set some kind of precedent. So yes, in theory, once your permission is implemented, it is extant forever. So actually you can take as long as you need. Of course, if your site becomes a complete eyesore over time, then there is, I think it's section 215 of the Act, which gives the local authority the powers to tidy up untidy sites. But again, the local authority don't want to use those powers. What they want to see is you finish your home. So they will probably get quite a lot of discussion before they even ever get to that point. But my point is that, to answer your question, is that no, there is no upper limit. And the laws also allows you to live on the site or on or adjacent to the site whilst the works are going on. So you can live in a mobile home, and that is quite a popular option because it avoids you paying rent. It's more secure and allows you to keep an eye on all the different trades coming and going. So that is quite a popular option for people if that suits your circumstances.
And when it comes to timelines for replacement dwellings, what is a realistic timeline?
I think the best time to engage a planning consultant is pre-purchase. So that would be when you're looking to buy something. So let's assume that I've given the green light to the project. You may then want to hold back on significant capital expenditure until you've exchanged contracts. But certainly at the point at which you've exchanged contracts, that is the time to appoint the planning consultant, who presumably will be the one appointing the rest of the team, whether that's an arboriculturalist, an ecologist, architect, if one's needed, highways engineer, etc. That process from initial instruction to submitting a planning application can take about 3 to 4 months. It can take much longer if you are starting that work outside of any of the main ecology survey seasons. So, for example, bats, I think, are May to September. And then there's great crested newts are another one that's important when they have a very narrow band from, I think it's March until early June, when they're in their breeding season. And so you need to be mindful of that, because you could just miss that window. And then if you have to do those surveys, and some local authorities insist on all of those being done on day one, in many ways those constraints are setting your timelines. But let's imagine you submit the application in 3 to 4 months from instructing your team. It goes into the planning authority. Every client says, well, that's going to take about 8 weeks. And of course, that's because ChatGPT or Google tells you that's how long planning applications take. But they take far longer than that in most cases. So I would say you need to allow 12 to 16 weeks for most replacement dwelling projects to be considered. Some of them get through in 8 weeks, of course, but there's usually something that comes up, whether it's a highways objection, or it could be that the tree survey that needs to be refreshed, or a policy could change that then means that you need your drainage report and strategy to be recast. A great example is when recently in drainage policy, we had to increase from a 30% rainfall allowance, plus your standard rainfall allowance for the area, plus 30, that went up to plus 50%. So, of course, that had a difference on the size and depth and profile of all the swales on a project. And that, of course, was a significant amount of work that you couldn't really predict. But for most projects, I would say, I'm making it sound like nothing gets determined in 8 weeks, but most get determined in 10 to 14 weeks, I would say. And of course, what your client doesn't want is a quick decision. They want an approval. There is a difference there. Of course, if you put too much pressure on a planning officer, they'll just give you a decision, but that may not be a favourable one. So you need to make sure the planning officer has got all the information they need. You are monitoring and checking applications for objections, legitimate objections, which may not necessarily be third-party views or opinions on your reports or the development more broadly. That's what people need to factor in. And of course, if the application gets refused, we're in T plus 6 months now from what we were talking about. I'm keeping track of this. If the application gets refused and it has to go to appeal, that could take an additional 6 to 9 months after. So really do need to allow a long time, and that becomes particularly relevant if you have clients who have optioned land, because an option agreement, you might have only struck your bargain with the landowner to be able to buy the land pursuant to a planning permission being granted. You may have only struck that bargain by saying to them, well, we'll be in and out within a year. And that is really important, that you have that flexibility in your contract to extend, say, for example, if an appeal is submitted. So that's one thing we always say to people, look, whatever you've negotiated, say, even if it's 1 year, say to them it's 1 year or until an appeal is decided, because we have appeals in the system for relatively simple matters. I can think of a certificate of lawfulness right now in Northants where that's been in the system for 2.5 years. And so you need to allow that period, as much time as you can possibly negotiate with the landowner, or if you already own the land or are about to buy, then that's different. You just need to make sure that you do not use a bridging loan in the planning system unless you have absolutely no other choice, because we've just seen too many instances where someone has been told by insert name of unqualified party that your planning application will be in and out in 3 months, 6 months, whatever that is. You go to appeal and you've got 18 months of eye-watering monthly interest rates on your bridging loan, and you're in a big problem. You've got a real big problem there. So just be very careful.
And what are the main reasons why our replacement dwelling planning permission might fail?
It's probably you wanting to jump too high in necessarily one go. So one thing you have to remember, your replacement dwelling will probably still have its permitted development rights. And that's quite important, because you could get permission for something and actually you could extend on the side or the back or convert the loft, which might get to you all the space that you were wanting. So my advice is to look at your design and think, is there actually that single story rear extension which we're going to use as a sunroom? We could probably build that under permitted development. So do we actually need to include it in this plan? Would it add a lot more volume or floor area, which might then be the straw that breaks the donkey's back in terms of the planner's objectives for your percentage increase? Of course, if your permitted development rights get removed, you can actually get those reinstated at appeal, and we've done that lots of times as well, because local authorities should be using those powers exceptionally rather than frivolously, and they have to have good reason to do that. And so yeah, you just need to factor that in. So I think that a stepped strategy is often the best thing to do. And I know some people might be rolling their eyes thinking, well, a planning consultant would say that because you get to charge more fees. And actually, yes, we do get to charge more fees, but we don't do it frivolously. We don't spend client money frivolously. We want to make sure that you are getting the smoothest ride through the planning process. And that does often mean staged phases. And it does also bank your risk as well. And I always say to people, if you're looking to get to house size D, if you go A to B, B to C, C to D, that has a much higher chance than just going straight in with D, because it might get refused, and then of course you're going to appeal, and that then comes down to a matter of objective judgment, and of course the inspector might side with the local authority.
Is there anything else we should fit into this conversation?
We did a little bit jovially earlier about don't assume the planning system is going to be quick, consistent and inexpensive. The planning system is made up of people. People use their judgment. Different people have different experience or prejudices or whatever that is, levels of experience in planning. And people don't always get it right. And that could be someone on the consultant side of it, or it could be someone in the local authority. It could be a planning inspector. It could be anyone involved. We're not infallible. We're all humans. And so, You just need to do the very best you can to make the most robust submission. And I do think taking advice is important, whether that's at the beginning of the process. You don't have to have a planning consultant prepare and submit and manage your application. It would certainly reduce the number of sides on that dice that you were rolling. That's one phrase I always use for clients. It certainly reduces the number of sides. But no one in my position would ever say to you, this is absolutely guaranteed to get planning permission. I can think of plenty of applications that we've submitted. A great example, infill house in a village with a primary school where there's a clear gap. And the only reason why there was a gap was because there was going to be a housing estate erected behind, but in the 80s, but that never happened. That application you'd think would be absolutely surefire bet, wouldn't you? Think that would be a 99% chance of success. The one I'm thinking of in Buckinghamshire ended up getting refused and getting dismissed at appeal. We did get the permission eventually. That's a different story. But don't ever look at something in just in two dimensions. Look at it in planning, looks at all those different factors. And then those things change over time, of course. We had a new MPPF about a year ago, just before Christmas last year. There's no reason to think we couldn't have another MPPF in the next month or in the next 6 months. Things change over time. So you could submit your application, a new NPPF comes out, and then all of a sudden the policy tests at which your local plan are being tested against have changed overnight. And that might be for the good or it might be for bad, depending on whether the government, if they do reissue the NPPF, presumably they're trying to do something to cajole Britain into getting on with building 1.5 million homes in this Parliament.
Mark, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ben. Nice to talk.
Get a recap today in our show notes, which you can find at houseplanninghelp.com/396 for this episode. There's a summary waiting for you there. We'll also have links to Mark Doodes Planning, and you can get interactive on social media if you have a comment or a question. Once again, houseplanninghelp.com/396. I have a couple of bits of business to finish up on. First of all, if you enjoyed today's podcast or you've got value out of any podcast in our series, I'd really appreciate a review of the podcast. Most apps give you the opportunity to write a review. It doesn't have to be long, just signpost it for someone else who's coming along, and that will bump us up in the rankings. So thank you for that. Also, I wanted to talk about social media, because this is something that I felt slightly strange about for a while, and I've just done my own thing. But over the course of probably a couple of years now, we've ditched a few of the major social media platforms just because, well, it's a mixture of things. It's not even any one thing. Firstly, because they seem less social and more focused on throwing as many different adverts or leading the way into things you have no interest in. It's fascinating how much junk seems to be in the feeds these days. Then you feel like there's a lot of friction going on, which I'm not sure is what I'm after. I like good discussion, upbeat, positive messaging. And then there's the whole business of politics changing around the world and thinking, could all of this be used against me? You know, when you sign up to the terms and conditions, no one is going to sit there every single time because you have so many of these to do and read into all the conditions. But I think if you did do that, you'd discover that your data could be used elsewhere. And then, given all the changes that have happened over the last few months, the privacy side seems more important now. So there's that aspect as well. There's the doom scrolling. If you've ever watched kids, we feel we're harsh parents. And, for example, they're not allowed proper phones. They'll get a brick phone until they're 14, which is definitely not what most kids are doing. And even so, just the attraction to get onto a phone, to get onto a screen, it's worrying. So all of those things combined have just meant that I've kept quiet about social media. However, my message is this: I don't think social media platforms are for life. So don't feel bad if you move on. We've moved on. We'll always have our most up-to-date social media platforms listed at houseplanninghelp.com. So go and have a look there. And I think going forwards, we're thinking open source. That makes sense, doesn't it? Because then you know it's not all being manipulated and other people can look at the code. And a greater focus on privacy. And those two things, I think, really matter. Thank you so much for being there. The House Planning Help podcast is produced by Regen Media, content that matters.